Good morning and welcome to our third and final day of Innovate for Climate. Now, today's sessions are going to bring you perspectives from the financial sector, and we're going to be asking leaders how institutions can drive finance towards countries while still keeping in mind their urgent, near and medium-term climate goals. Before I welcome our first speaker, though, in case you've just joined us today, I encourage you to complete your profile on the website to make the most of your networking opportunities. And while you're there, do please sign up to any of the workshop sessions you might like to attend. There are plenty to choose from, and you can find out more details on our agenda. And then there's the marketplace as well. That's worth a visit. You'll be able to connect with innovative startups and entrepreneurs, all showcasing their ideas and their solutions. We really want you to be part of this discussion. So please do join us via the community page and tag us on social media using the hashtag #InnovateForClimate. Right. So with all that housekeeping now out of the way, let me welcome Stephanie von Friedeburg, Senior Vice President of Operations at the International Finance Corporation, I4C for short, to share her thoughts. Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you, Anita. Good morning and welcome to the third day of the Innovate for Climate. As Anita said, my name is Stephanie von Friedeburg, and I am the Senior Vice President of Operations at the International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. Over the last 2 days, you have heard great discussions about how national plans and policies can help countries achieve net zero emissions. Today, I would like to talk to you about what we need to, in addition to plans and policies. What we need is finance. We will not get to net zero without it, and private capital in particular will play a major role. Why? It's simple math. Greening the global economy is going to be a massive undertaking. A recent McKinsey study found that capital spending on physical assets from renewable energy plants to electric cars would reach $275 trillion, or $9.2 trillion per year on average, between now and 2050. You will not find that kind of money in government coffers. To come even close, you need to look to the private sector. Institutions like I4C and other development finance institutions can do a lot, and we are. As of last May, we had committed $9 billion from our own account to climate-related projects and leveraged an additional $4.3 billion through over 200 emerging market financial institution partners. But compare this to the assets of just the top 50 emerging market banks, over $35 trillion. Compare this to the top 1,000 banks in the world, and we have assets of just under $150 trillion. Then consider that there are tens of thousands of banks globally and many other institutional investors, and you may begin to see the scale of opportunity here. We clearly need to drive the banking sector and capital markets more generally to net zero in emerging markets and in every country in the world. There are 3 things we need to do to achieve this. First, we need better regulation. Regulators play a key role in what banks and asset managers can and cannot do with their capital. When regulators say what needs to happen, banks will follow. But right now, there are too many different frameworks, standards, and other forms of guidance that cover sustainability. 200 frameworks, in fact, across 40 countries. This is unhelpful because every time an investor wants to move money toward climate finance, they are faced with inconsistent rules and regulations. Standardization here would be helpful, not only to encourage investment, but to measure impact. We need a common understanding, taxonomies, metrics, and standards on what investments are green and good for the climate. This is part of what I4C does. We work closely with governments and regulators to set the stage for more investment. And we have seen standards work very well in steering the market in the right direction. To name just one example, our EDGE certification helped to dramatically increase the size of the market for green buildings in places like Colombia and Vietnam. Second, we need to expand the range of climate finance products and services. The financial sector is already developing new sophisticated tools to raise money for the green economy. This year alone, the green bond market is expected to reach $1 trillion for the first time. IFC has issued over $10 billion in green bonds. We also issued our first blue bond in 2020 to Indorama Ventures Global Services, which will help the company recycle 50 billion plastic bottles a year. Other mechanisms like a global carbon market can help increase the availability of financing options for new projects. Third and finally, we need to develop a pool of bankable projects. The risk-return ratio of climate-friendly projects in emerging markets is often seen as too high for large investors. One way to address this is to use blended finance to mitigate the risks of investing in pioneering technologies that are vital for the green transformation, but are not yet ready for commercial funding. Donor funds from governments, philanthropies, and the like can be used to de-risk these projects and bring in private investors. Ultimately, this brings down the cost of new technologies to a point where they are viable in the market. This is an area of focus for us. As of June 30th of last year, IFC had deployed $2.4 billion of concessional donor funds to support 316 high-impact projects in over 50 countries. These projects have leveraged $9.1 billion in IFC financing and more than $8.4 billion of other private sources. This is also an area of great potential. Historically, every dollar of blended climate finance deployed has catalyzed, on average, about $10 of commercial funding from IFC and other third parties. In conclusion, and fortunately, one of the obstacles we do not see is interest. Institutional investors and private capital funds want to invest in green opportunities. This was clear at COP26 in Glasgow, where a consortium of over 450 financial firms across 45 countries with $130 trillion in assets committed to align their businesses, spending, and investing with net zero goals. The question is how to make sure that capital reaches profitable climate-smart opportunities in the sectors and geographies that need it most. Our challenge is to bridge that gap between interest and action. Thank you, and do enjoy the sessions today.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And let's follow up on some of what Stephanie was talking about now with our finance panel, led by Barbara Buchner, Global Managing Director of the Climate Policy Initiative. Barbara is going to be joined by guests, and they're going to chew over the theme for today: how the financial sector must act now on the path to net zero. So joining Barbara, we have Mary Schapiro, Vice Chair for Global Public Policy at Bloomberg. Mary's also the Special Advisor to the Founder, Head of the TCFD Secretariat, Vice Chair for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and Bloomberg LP. You know what? That is quite some business card you must have there, Mary. And we are also very excited to welcome Patricio Sepúlveda, Head of the Public Debt Office for the Ministry of Finance in Chile. Barbara, it's over to you.
Thank you, Anita. It's a real pleasure of being here. My name is Barbara Buchner. I'm the Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative. It's fantastic to have a wonderful panel here to discuss how the financial sector can accelerate climate actions. I'm very pleased to be joined by Mary Schapiro, the Vice Chair for Public Policy and Special Advisor to the Founder and Chairman at Bloomberg, and also Vice Chair of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the GFANZ, and by Patricio Sepúlveda, who is the Head of Public Debt Office at the Ministry of Finance in Chile. So first, I'd like to discuss how the change in investment landscape in the near term can really support the key transitions needed for cutting global emissions in half by 2030. I think, as we all know, climate science tells us we need to decarbonize the global economy by mid-century at the latest to avoid dangerous climate change and the worst climate impacts. So over the past couple of years, there has been a wave of momentum behind their idea of getting to net zero emissions. And net zero really has become the dominant lens through which we see climate action. And this is a significant win for climate action in that it enshrines the goal of getting to zero at the center of global climate policy, rather than centering the debate around percentage reductions. But unfortunately, despite all the promising net zero target announcements and pledges that we keep hearing about, actual financial flows and portfolios remain deeply misaligned with Paris Agreement goals. So the net zero targets are finally starting to materialize, but now it's really time for the money to follow. So, Mary, let me start with you. As we all know, a growing number of financial firms are looking to raise their net zero ambitions, including the now more than 450 financial firms that have come together under GFANZ. While this positive momentum is strongly welcomed, the net zero pledges are usually long-term in nature and do not need to be met until 2050. So how can we ensure that the financial sector takes climate action in the short term to respond to the urgent need to mobilize climate finance ahead of 2030? And Mary, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Barbara and Patricio. It's very nice to be with both of you today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about GFANZ in particular. So for those who don't know, GFANZ, which is not a very nice sounding acronym for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is a practitioner-led global coalition of financial sector institutions that are organized into sector-specific alliances, including banking, insurance, asset owners, asset managers, service providers, and investment consultants. And when a company signs up to be a GFANZ member, they essentially commit to the UN's Race to Zero criteria. And that includes a commitment to use science-based guidelines to reach net zero emissions across all emissions scopes by 2050. It requires setting 2030 interim targets that actually represent a fair share of the 50% decarbonization that's required by the end of the decade. They commit to setting and publishing a net zero transition strategy, and they commit to transparent reporting and accounting on progress against that strategy and their targets. And they commit to adherence to strict restrictions on the use of offsets. So I think as these commitments show, it's not really just a long-term focus for GFANZ. It's both a long-term and near-term results that we're focused on. Our members haven't just committed to being net zero by 2050 at the latest. They've also agreed to set targets for their fair share of the 50% of greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030 that are necessary to keep the world on track for a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. And they also commit, for example, with banks, that within 18 months of joining, they will set out detailed sector-specific emissions reduction plans. We know achieving these won't be easy. The global economy transition will require a massive reallocation of capital. It will require development of clear net zero transition plans that support real economy companies in their transition. It will require investment in the development of assets for a low carbon economy, financing the decarbonization of existing high emitting assets, and supporting the early retirement of those high emitting assets that can't be decarbonized economically. So very, very significant commitments. And we at the GFANZ Secretariat have been working very hard to develop the kind of tools and frameworks and guidance that are necessary for financial institutions to turn all of these net zero commitments into credible, actionable plans that are very much rooted in science. So the work we'll be publishing this year includes frameworks for transition plans and managed phase out of high emitting assets, financial institution guidance on sectoral decarbonization pathways, financial sector guidance for real economy transition plans. That is, what do financial institutions need from real economy companies in their transition plans? An analysis of the financing needs for clean energy and fossil fuels, and guidance on portfolio alignment, and actually much more. So we have a very busy year leading up to COP27 ahead of us.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. I think you've highlighted a number of critical components already and elements of ensuring a real transition towards net zero. Let me just mention a few. I think really putting science as a foundation of all your decisions, making sure that you put in place a strategy, but then also a plan that really can have clear interim targets and also look more detailed at the sector-specific pathways there. And then finally, I think committing to transparent reporting, really making sure that there is accountability will be critical to this transition. But with that, let me now come to you, Patricio. I think clearly we are hearing that the agenda to green the financial sector is rocketing in recent years. But we also know that many of these developments are taking place in advanced economies. So how can we ensure that climate finance flows to countries that need it most? And what is really your experience in Chile with that?
Yes, thank you, Barbara, for the question. And happy to share this panel with Mary. So first, I would like to thank the invitation. I think that is very important to share the Chilean experience, but also to give some thoughts regarding this very interesting topic. Regarding your question, I think that effectively the green efforts are normally in accordance to the emission intensity. So, of course, in principle, it's partially logical that the most advanced economy have to do the most of the effort, because they are the country that participate in the pollution in most important way than the other country like Chile, for example. But I think that it's true that the greening of the financial sector needs the involvement of all the country, like Chile, like the country in Latin America, because this is very well related to all the ESG topics in general. So I think that in this regard, I think that it's very important to highlight that the ESG bonds that we issue here in Chile and also in the region, the Chilean institution have issued effectively an important share of green in the continent. But this is not the unique financial tool to face the climate change. We have also seen additional initiatives like direct loans, funds. We have in some way the green taxes is always and financial tools. But I think that it's very important that all of these instruments are available, especially for the country that have low access to the conventional instrument, that country that is not a frequent issuer like Chile. We understand that to promote all these instruments, we need some standardization of the market. We know that it's very important the adoption of the global taxonomies. We are in Chile in this process to have a Chilean taxonomy, but this is in work in process. In other way, I think that the leadership of the public sector, in the case of Chile, the government, is essential as a way to coordinate the green financial sector. Not only because we are making very important effort in the regulation front, but also because we establish benchmark and we encourage the development of all these financial instruments, and also to establish a very important standard transparency in terms of the reports and also in terms of the impacts of the investment in the green sector. We understand that the most developed markets are more likely to take the lead in this regard because they also have a deeper market. However, in order to channel the necessary resource for the climate change mitigation and adaptation, I think that it is essential that developing countries also promote and lead more the greening of the financial markets.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patricio. I think, again, some very important points. And I think already, some themes coming up in this discussion here around, taxonomy, guidance, like better information. I think that brings me actually back, Mary, to you, wearing just your hat as the former chairperson of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, as the leader, of course, for the task force of climate-related financial disclosures. I'd love just to get your views a little bit on, coming to the point that Patricio just made around taxonomies and the need for kind of more transparency. What is your view of the recently proposed SEC rules for climate-related disclosures?
Sure. So I think transparency and disclosure are the foundation of really everything we're talking about here, whether it's GFANs, whether it's countries issuing green bonds or sustainability bonds, whether it's the ability to invoke the power of the capital markets to drive us towards a more sustainable future. It really all rests on a foundation of disclosure and transparency. And I will say that as someone who spent the last 7 years of my career really committed to disclosure of climate-related financial risk, I was actually thrilled to see the SEC not only propose rules on climate risk disclosure, but also to base them on the foundations of the TCFD framework that was developed and published originally in 2017. When I was SEC chair way back in 2010, we actually published the first guidance from the agency on the disclosure of climate risk. And as you can imagine, it was almost hostilely received at that time. So much has happened in 10 or 12 years to bring this much more into the mainstream and to have a much greater understanding by policymakers that this is actually material financial information that is critical for investors and others to allocate capital in a thoughtful way. But so what I think the SEC has done is really very much in response to the demands of investors for consistent and comparable disclosure of climate risks. And I think it was so important they based it on the TCFD because, in a sense, the SEC was the missing puzzle piece with respect to TCFD adoption. Globally, there are over 3,200 firms that have endorsed TCFD disclosure. They represent a market capitalization of $28 trillion. 8 jurisdictions have announced mandatory reporting requirements based on the TCFD. The recommendations of the TCFD were embraced by global standard setters, by the G20 and the G7, by IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, the Financial Stability Board, the European Commission, the Network for Greening the Financial System Organization of Central Banks. So widely accepted globally, but less so in the United States. So by basing the SEC's proposed set of disclosure rules on the TCFD, they've taken an important step forward in making the global approach consistent and comparable. And I think that will really help investors in making their capital allocation decisions. I think the other really important piece of this is the International Sustainability Standards Board, the essentially subsidiary of the IFRS, that recently released its exposure drafts on climate-related disclosure. And again, they have based their work largely on the TCFD framework, almost totally on the TCFD framework. And again, as the ISSB standards are finalized and adopted around the world, IFRS is used in over 140 countries, we will have better consistency and comparability of data globally upon which investors can make their capital allocation decisions, as well as lenders and insurers and others. So I really applaud the efforts of the SEC. I know there are details about the rules that people are uncomfortable with or not certain about. That will all get worked out, I believe, in the comment process that the agency's engaged in now. And we can hope that before the end of the year, we'll have final rules from the SEC that bring it right into the mainstream of the rest of the globe.
Thanks so much, Mary. And I couldn't agree more. I think I'm very excited about the rules, and also felt like this was something really missing in the US. So I think this is really progress. And I think hearing also what Patricio said before, that there is a taxonomy also evolving in Chile, I think this is so important that we come towards, also with the ISSB, come towards some consistency, comparability, which really will allow better allocations of capital. So very, very excited about that. And as you said, I think don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You know, obviously there's always something we can improve, but I think it's a fantastic start. But let me come back, Patricio, to you a little bit and come back to what you already started to allude to, the importance also of having access to financial tools, to financial instruments that really can help unlock more capital, more investments for climate action. And you were talking very briefly about the recently issued sovereign sustainability-linked bond that Chile's Ministry of Finance has been working on. But I'd just love to hear from you a little bit more. What are your priorities for the next year in contributing to Chile's climate targets. And again, if you want to maybe elaborate a little bit more on the bond that you've been issuing, that'll be great.
I think that regarding the work to green the financial sector since 2018, we have begin this challenge of greening the government debt of Chile. So we established very well practice. We effectively established benchmark of transparency. In the case of Chile, we obtained the certification following the CBI criteria, which consider provide a very high degree of confidence. And we have been followed by a different corporate in Chile. Indeed, after the issuance of Chile, other corporates have followed this example. But of course, we think that there is still a gap to cover. Going back to the Chilean strategy, so the label bond have become fundamental for the finances of Chile. So this is not an opportunistic strategy. This is totally incorporated into the general strategy of the debt management. So we incorporate as a explicit objective to promote the development of ESG green asset class, basically to attract foreign investment and support the needs, infrastructure needs basically, but also to diversify our investor base. In 2019, we become the first country in the America to issue green bonds. And as you mentioned, in this year, we issue the first sovereign SLB. And this instrument allow us to increase our investor base. And also, I think that it was, and it is, the first ever SLB from a sovereign issuer anywhere in the world. We expected that this transaction, the last one, opens a new path for the countries to link the financial activity in the capital markets in line or related to our ESG commitments. I will give you some numbers. So in Chile, we have about 33 billion of label bonds, and it represents 29% of the government debt. We expect that this will increase over time. We think that this share of 29% of our debt, we expect to increase this in a combination of social green and SLB instrument. We consider that the SLB instrument that we execute last year was very useful because it make more space for the government to issue more ESG instrument in line with the commitment that we have in the case of Chile related to the NDC. The SLB that we issue are basically related to the reduction of GHG emission that we target by 2030. And also we have the other SPT is related to achieve 60% by 2032 of electricity generation derived from non-conventional renewable energy. We had about 9% in 2040. Currently, we have at the end of last year 27% of non-conventional renewable energy in Chile. So to reach in the next 8 years, sort of 10 years, 60% is an important challenge for the country. It's not so easy to reach this target. I think that we have also different other initiatives in the country in order to reach a target. Recently, we approved the law of climate change. That I think that is a very important legal framework in order to assign responsibility for reducing the emission in the country, in the state agency, but also in the corporate sector. We have an important also regulation in terms of the energy efficiency in the country. We have a law that effectively have the plan to be focused on industrial, mining, and also the transport sector in order to reduce about 2% the emission annually. I think that we have in Chile another very important plan. This is basically the decommissioning of the coal plants. Is also in line with the increase of the non-conventional renewable energy. We have, as I mentioned, 9% in 2040, 27 right now, and we expect to increase and to reach about 80% by 2035. So this is an important challenge that we have in the country. We have in Chile an important plan to develop the green hydrogen. Chile is in the country that have an important competitive value in this sector. So we are in the government also together with the private sector an important agenda to develop the green hydrogen.
Thank you so much, Patricio. I think very rich, and you already answered a few other questions I had on what are some of the approaches that you're using in Chile to really ensure a race to the top. And I think what you've said, like this combination of regulation, but also thinking about what Mary actually mentioned before, like the managed phase out of fossil fuels, of coal in Chile as well, and really thinking about also using other levers to support technology and like focus on R&D in the context, for example, of hydrogen, I think is so important. So I think that's fantastic from just to hear really how Chile is actually leading the way there. But let me come back to you, Mary, just for a last question to you. I think it is clear also from what we hear from both of you on what is needed in order to go towards net zero, is that we ultimately will need a transformation of the whole financial ecosystem. So Mary, maybe let me just come to your role as the Vice Chair for Public Policy at Bloomberg, but also the Vice Chair of GFunds, which we've already talked about. Just understanding from your side a little bit, what do you think will be the hardest steps to really take action and really help reduce financial institutions' emissions, particularly the Scope 3 emissions from investments in the next few years? And, how, again, can we ensure a race to the top in that context?
Well, it will all be hard, but as we've talked about, there really is no choice. I think, first of all, we need to accelerate clean energy investment to triple its current pace now through the end of the decade. And of course, we've known that for a while, that this kind of increase in financing would be essential for a net zero world. But now, of course, we have another reason to act, which is energy independence and clean energy independence at that, given what has happened with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. But I think the role of financial institutions in this transition to a net zero world is twofold. The first is shifting capital to new opportunities that will support and accelerate the transition. And the second is financing companies that really must pivot their business away from carbon-intensive activities. We know that a smooth transition will require some investment in fossil fuels and carbon-intensive assets in order to phase them out. To my mind, that is neither licensed to fund all fossil fuel investment, nor is it an exercise in immediately firing clients and clearing balance sheets. It really is an exercise in financing the transition. But in terms of what private banks and investors can do to participate in this race to the top, I would really strongly encourage them to join the GFands Alliance that's appropriate for them and the network. These 7 sector-specific alliances are really representing different parts of the financial ecosystem, which, as you say, all of which must move to a net zero world. It requires their commitments, as we've talked about, to the UN Race to Zero criteria, meaning they have to set net zero commitments. They have to have a transition plan. They have to have interim targets for decarbonization by 2030, and they have to commit to transparent reporting and accounting in line with the Race to Zero criteria. But they'll benefit very much from being part of a college of peers who are all confronting the same kinds of problems, and they'll benefit, of course, as we hope the whole world will, from the presence of tools, frameworks, and guidance that GFANZ will be producing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Mary and Patricio. Let me just very briefly try to sum up here what I've heard, and I think it's been a very powerful discussion with both of you. I think, in a nutshell, I think we do not have any other choice. I think the future has been decided. It is green. So let's just think about how can we accelerate the transition towards that future. I think what I've heard and what I've said at the beginning, net zero has clearly become the dominant lens through which we see climate action. And you both, this panel here has highlighted important efforts that are going on in this area, showing what the financial sector and what governments and countries like Chile are doing to translate net zero emissions into practice. And I think it is fundamental to ensure really that the total of all our efforts equals the sum of its part. And for this, I think I've heard from both of you a few things that need to happen. I think certainly, first of all, transparency and disclosure is the foundation for change. I think we need consistency, comparability, benchmarks, and more standardization to really enable a better allocation of capital. And we really must improve disclosures and data across both the public and private sectors. I think it's impossible to set an efficient course forward without knowing where we stand today. And I think also the importance of plans and having, interim targets and clear sectoral targets, I think, are extremely important. So it's fantastic, Mary, to hear about all the efforts going on in this context. I think second, certainly continue the importance of policy. I think, Patricia, you did highlight the importance of regulations also to prepare an enabling environment to make sure that we trigger research and development for some technologies such as hydrogen, but really to make sure that the private sector actually has the right enabling environment to come in as well. I think third, I have heard from you as well, and I am happy, Patricia, that you talked about some experiences, the need for tools to attract foreign or public and private capital, really to expand the investor base. And I think it's important to continue to come up with the right financial instruments and business models that can allow us to unlock the capital for climate action. And I think for what I've certainly also heard from all of you is we need to work together across the financial ecosystem. We need to coordinate better between public, private, between developed and developing countries, across the financial sector. Clear plea back to Mary to join GFANZ. I think this is an amazing effort that's going on. Lots of details to be sorted out, but this is where you can make a change and be part of this change in the financial sector. And I think particularly because, as you said, I think financial sector really has two roles. And I do want to kind of repeat that because I think it's so important for all of us to think about that. First, to really shift the capital, but then also to finance companies to pivot away from these high carbon efforts. So just to close here, I think for me, what is really important is we need to coordinate better also across the silos of public and private, and the many initiatives to really foster the integrity of net zero pledges, and all that will require us to think how can we do more of the good, the green investments, but also how can we really accelerate the managed phase out of the high carbon assets, which are part of the transition, but how can we come up with the right models there? And I look forward very much to continue this conversation. This issue of integrity, of credibility, of viability is an incredibly important one. It's a complicated one, but I think this panel here has shown you the good news. There is lots of work going on in this context, and I very much look forward to continuing to work with all of you on making progress. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation here. Many thanks to the organizers for making this conversation possible. And with that, let me close the panel here. And I think I'm handing back to Anita. So thank you very much.
Well, many thanks to Barbara, Mary and Patricio. And it is now my very great pleasure to welcome Emmanuel Assuin, Delegated Director General in charge of financial stability for Banque de France. Welcome to Emmanuel from Paris. Delighted you could join us for this fireside chat today. So the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system, NGFS, to most people watching, we know the membership has grown rapidly since the inception to 108 members, I believe, 17 observers to date. So this momentum is very, very positive. Sounds great. Many countries, though, especially developing countries, are still at the nascent stage of greening their financial sector. So what is NGFS's role in helping countries move from ambition to implementation in the near term?
Many thanks, Anita. So NGFS, indeed, as you mentioned, spans over almost all continents, covering up to 85% of carbon emissions in the world. This is very illustrative of the willingness of central banks and supervisors to tackle and address climate risk from their perspective. But it is also a success which stems from the very perspective of the NGFS, which is a very concrete and practical mindset approach. Just to illustrate what is helping in order to go from ambition to real implementation is that we take a very practical approach, notably by sharing and publishing very practical guides based on all members' contributions and experience, whatever the subjects: financial stability, monetary policy, supervision, of course, but also we put together as much possible resources in order to build things together. This is the example of the climate scenarios, for instance, that we developed over the last couple of years as the members use them. And we did in France, the ECB is doing so currently, the Bank of England as well, during this year for the stress test climate exercise. We update them and we fine-tune them in order that they become more accurate and easier to be used by others, which have not done so yet. And one other aspect is that we constantly train all together. So we have set up a climate training alliance last July with other financial organizations in order to share and to enhance all together the skills in this field. So that's quite a very concrete mindset.
It does sound concrete, but you're aware, Emmanuel, you don't need me to tell you, that there is this global debate going on right now on the role and mandate of central banks and financial supervisors in the climate sphere. So tell me this, can the financial sector authorities speed things up ahead of 2030? And what are the areas where central banks can provide leadership?
A debate on the mandate. We have very clear mandates: financial stability, monetary policy, with regard to central banks and supervisors. And the thing is that climate change is a problem, is a source of macroeconomic instability, is a source of financial instability. So as central banks and as supervisors, we have to understand and to address accurately and fully all the developments which are related to those risks. And we have to strengthen the resilience of the financial sector in this regard. So what we do is that we have set up a plan which was quite widely shared at the occasion of the Glasgow summit at the end of last year. So we made NGFS Glasgow Declaration with eight very clear objectives on which we want to deliver and to provide strong leadership, as we have done since 2017. And just to cite not the 8 of them, but a few very illustrative objectives. That's the enhancements of the climate scenarios I've just spoken about. A very important one is deepening our analysis on the how to integrate climate change into the monetary policy framework, bridge the data gaps. That's a huge problem in order to identify and manage adequately the climate related risks. And also, internally for corporate purpose is to help central banks to deliver on TCFD aligned reporting, which is quite also an achievement to have. And also, of course, that's the training aspect, and to ensure that we have all the capabilities to be uplifted as far as the different mandates we have, including, of course, first of them, the supervisory capabilities in this regard. Maybe one last one is the very, just to ensure that we have global consistency in the supervisory practices, because we have to get to the objective all aligned globally.
Okay. The net zero pledges of financial institutions are, how shall I put it, very diverse, shall we say, in terms of scope and design. That makes it perhaps difficult to track how they're doing. So how can we make sure that financial institutions are following through on their long-term commitments?
So that's, having a lot of pledges and a lot of things like that are very good news, and we are very happy to have that. But indeed, we have a problem of diversity, a problem of heterogeneity as far as the scopes of those commitments, the targets they have, the metrics they use, and which is quite a problem for comparability. And we need, commitments are good, but we need also to compare and to assess the actual progress of the different firms, because, intents and pledges, but what we need is actual climate action, which will make the difference. So just in order to, get things better and to have a state of play which should progress in this regard, we have two avenues. Regulation first, supervision second. So regulation, we are convinced that it is the very sole way to impose publication of statement and consistent information across the financial sector and across the globe at the international level. Hopefully, the FSB, the standard setting bodies are very aware of this need and are currently working on it. On the second aspect, supervision and commitments to become real and to be real, we consider that it's the supervision of those commitments are the only way to make them credible. So that's why in France we have taken steps over the last couple of years in order to assess those commitments. So it's done by the ACPS, the French Supervisory Authority for Banks and Insurers, and also by the Market Authority, AMF. And we are doing a joint report in order to assess those commitments to see how binding and how effective those commitments are, just to ensure credibility. And there's a by-side virtue of those assessments, which is to allow and enable firms to harmonize and to have converging metrics, targets, ratios, and methodologies, which is not the case otherwise. So that helps improving the quality of and the accuracy of the information they provide publicly. So that's very important to go ahead with supervising those commitments and pledges. I mentioned, if I may, Anita, one aspect on the different targets that we have, in the pledges and in the commitments. Having different targets is not a problem, but we have to be mindful that what matters is not only that we have to reach net zero by 2050, but that we have to peak global emissions by 2025, so far before 2050, and that we have to halve them by 2030. And we cannot, there's only one way, and we cannot play our way out with, carbon offsets and things like that. So pledges, commitments on real things in order to reduce carbon emissions are the only things that we expect from a supervisory and a central bank perspective.
That 2025 date is so near, and thank you so much for such a clear and candid appraisal. Emmanuel, merci and au revoir. And joining me now to expand on today's topic is Ma Jun, President of the Beijing Institute of Finance and Stability. Welcome to you, Ma Jun. Now, you've been leading the research agenda for the NGFS. Tell me, what are the most interesting questions you'd like to put to the powers that be to urge more urgency in the transition towards those goals set in Paris?
Thank you, Anita. Over the past 4 years, I served as a chairperson for 2 work streams under the NGFS. In the first 2 years, I was chairing the supervision work stream, which initially looked at the risk differentials between green and brown assets, and also looked into regulatory options to incentivize green lending and green investment. We compiled a few documents on methodologies for environmental and climate risk analysis, which included a 600-page report on case studies of risk analysis methodology. And this document includes methodology that can be used by banks, investors, and insurance companies. And many of these methods are, in fact, now widely used by the industry for climate stress testing and scenario analysis. More recently, I chaired the research workstream under the NGFS, which has focused on a study on how central banks and supervisors can play a role in protecting nature and biodiversity. We launched a study group between the NGFS and Inspire, which is co-chaired by myself and Professor Nick Robin, on the topic of biodiversity and financial stability. We just produced the final report on March 24, and the report is now on the NGFS website. For the first time in history, we presented this view from the NGFS, which is biodiversity loss will become a threat to financial stability, and therefore, central banks and supervisors should take actions to guard against this risk. I think this new consensus has historical implication, which is similar to the view formed 5-6 years ago when central banks and supervisors began to realize that climate change was a source of financial risk. Our biodiversity study group has made 5 recommendations for specific actions. Number 1, be aware of biodiversity-related financial risks. Number 2, building capacity to analyze these risks. And thirdly, measuring exposure of your financial system to the risk. Number 4, take actions to mitigate these biodiversity-related risks. And finally, mobilizing financing to protect nature and biodiversity. I expect many central banks and supervisors will take actions in the coming few years in this direction.
As the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, where is international collaboration most urgently needed, do you think, to accelerate the financial sector's support on climate action?
China initiated this G20 Green Finance Study Group in 2016, when China was presidency of G20. This study group reached the consensus on the need to scale up green finance globally. Last year, during the Italian presidency, the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group was upgraded to a working group. So it's now called the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And I continue to have the honor to co-chair this group on behalf of China. Last year, the main achievement of the working group was the release of the G20 System of Finance Roadmap, which will guide the international work on system of finance in the coming few years. Let me give you 4 highlights of this roadmap, which I believe will shape the future direction of system of finance. Number 1, given the backdrop that there are too many different standards, principles, and frameworks trying to define what is green and sustainable, the G20 roadmap highlighted the need and proposed actions to improve comparability and interoperability of system of finance taxonomies. Number 2, the G20 endorsed the launch of International Sustainability Standard Board, which will develop a set of internationally consistent set of reporting standards on sustainability-related information. Again, the purpose of this is to overcome the problem of lack of global coordination towards disclosure. Number 3, the G20 roadmap stated that the G20 System of Finance Working Group will work with other IOs to develop a framework for transition finance to enhance the ability of the global financial system to support transition of carbon-intensive sectors and the companies towards net zero. In fact, this is a major task for the G20 System of Finance Working Group this year. Number 4, the G20 roadmap stated in several places that over the medium term, the system of finance framework, including taxonomy, disclosure, and risk analysis, should go beyond climate and cover other issues on sustainability, such as nature and biodiversity. And this message is very much consistent with that from the NGFS.
That's a really fascinating contribution there. Thank you very much indeed. Now, as we move forward to our close of today's plenary, it is my great honour to introduce our final speaker. It is 6 months since COP26 and the commitments that were made there. It's also 6 months till COP27 kicks off in Egypt. So really, it's an ideal time to take stock. To talk us through what might come in the next phase, it is my great pleasure to welcome Patricio Espinosa, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Welcome to you, Patricio.
Dear colleagues and friends, it's a pleasure to provide the closing remarks at a session that has, I'm sure, produced an exceptional number of ideas for the financial sector to prioritize and accelerate climate action ahead of 2030. I will focus on 2 key areas. First, why it's so important to deliver the finance the world requires to address climate change. And second, how finance is central to our success this year and particularly at COP27. We must first address the present before speaking about the future. From a finance standpoint, the biggest obstacle in our process is that developed nations have yet to fulfill their pledge to mobilize $100 billion to developing nations. This issue, a cornerstone of the Paris Agreement, has been with us for more than a decade. It threatens to create a deficit of trust between developed and developing nations at a time when we need progress on implementation more than ever. The Climate Finance Delivery Plan in Glasgow was encouraging, but nations must deliver on it. And it must include measures to double the provision of adaptation finance. The $100 billion is one issue of many related to finance. We know governments alone cannot deliver all the climate finance the world requires. COP26 called upon international financial institutions and multilateral development banks to step up their mobilization of financial support to developing countries. Again, this includes adaptation support. Scaled up climate finance from these institutions, whether in grant or concessional terms, can act as catalysts. It spurs more climate investment and drives greater private sector engagement, especially in developing nations. Yet the form of this support is crucial. Currently, the the majority of climate finance is offered as loans and not grants. This adds to the financial stress developing nations already face. Interest rates are already rising. Spiraling debt is not the answer. So when we talk about climate finance and climate action for developing nations, we need more than money. We also need innovative economic thinking. That's why this conference is so important. You are leaders, innovators, and financial experts. We are deeply appreciative of your efforts and look forward to the results of this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot simply look at climate finance in isolation from the financial system and global investment as a whole. Making the transition from incremental change to transformational climate action means business and investment portfolios must go beyond one or two climate investments, especially if those same portfolios are heavily outweighed by investments supporting a business as usual scenario. I fully understand the transformational change we require cannot happen overnight, but we are rapidly running out of time. The science clearly shows the world is far off track with respect to stabilizing global temperatures by 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. If we want prosperity for economic and social systems well into the future, we must make the difficult decisions now. In Glasgow, we heard several financial pledges by nations and businesses, many designed to support developing countries. This was encouraging, but we must see those commitments implemented. And they must be included in short and long-term national climate plans. Looking ahead to COP27, parties must continue to support the implementation process that will accelerate the alignment of financing activities with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we need to finally see the implementation of several financial commitments already made, especially the ones focusing on Africa, least developed nations, and small island developing states. This will help developing nations do their part in boosting their climate action in ways that fit their specific needs and priorities. We have seen some progress. Nearly $3 billion in Green Climate Fund resources were approved for 32 climate projects around the world in 2021. This was a good start, but we must do more. That begins with a replenishment of the fund this year. And we need agreement on a new collective quantified goal on climate finance for the post-2025 period. At COP27, we also need to see more finance for adaptation and loss and damage. All sources must be tapped beyond traditional public and private sources to include non-traditional partners, organizations, and arrangements. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a long road. It's a road lined with challenges, but incredible opportunity as well. We have an opportunity, one that comes along rarely, to really build the kind of future we want. One that is clean, green, sustainable, and resilient. One that is also prosperous in all senses of the term. UN climate change stands ready to provide whatever support is needed to build that future. While we have far to go, we have seen encouraging progress in the financial sector. An appetite for change does exist. Let's work together to not only further encourage that change, but significantly accelerate it. Thank you.
It's really, really great to hear from you, Patricia. And aren't we in an interesting place, sort of on an island between two COPs? Now, before we close for today, I'd really love you to hear from some inspiring young climate innovators. It really is worth listening to what they have to tell us. And then you're free to enjoy all that I4C has to offer. Just please do be back with us for our closing ceremony. Jürgen Vögele, the Vice President of Sustainable Development for the World Bank Group, will be our headline speaker. And he's agreed to answer some of the questions that you've been asking over the last 3 days. We're also very, very excited that Valvanera Ulargui, Director General of the Spanish Climate Change Office at the Ministry for Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge, will be joining us, hopefully, fingers crossed, with some good news about 2023. Trust me, you don't want to miss that. So put it in your planners, 2 p.m. Eastern Time for the closing ceremony. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day, the workshops, the marketplace, and do have a listen to what our young climate innovators have to say. Cheerio.
Hello everyone, my name is Caroline Kimani. I am from Nairobi, Kenya. My priority would definitely be nature-based solutions. And these are actions that are geared towards protecting or sustainably managing or restoring ecosystems. I believe they have the ability to provide a myriad of benefits and they're able to address several SDGs simultaneously. So benefits such as human well-being, biodiversity benefits, adaptation and resilience, and even climate mitigation.